always trying to whittle down, all these pages are spilling out. I always tell myself, nobody's going to read something 700 pages long, Andy. Whittle down, whittle down.
Yeah, well, it's great that you're so prolific, though.
Well, I mean, not all of it is good, so.
Well, but it's coming out.
Yeah, it's coming out, but that's a very positive way to look at it.
Yes,
thank you.
Because I'm always usually creatively constipated.
I think it just depends. I normally find that there's just so much I've got to take out because it's not good. And I have to be strict with myself and say that, yeah, it's okay. But nobody wants 10 paragraphs on that particular thing that you've just written about. Make it short and concise for them. You want to read that much. They don't want to read that much. Make it easy for them to get it. And it's hard because I kind of want to impress them, but I forget that they might just be bored. They might want to get on to the next chapter, and get on with it, basically.
I think you probably sell yourself short.
Well, yeah, exactly. That is culturally baked into the cake, right? Baked into the cake. They're not allowed to you're not allowed to sing your own praises. You're not allowed to sing your own praises. It's vulgar, so it's you can't do it. Can't do it.
Wow. I don't know. Gotta have some confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Just don't tell anybody about it. That's the rule. That's the rule. Hi, Joshua. How are you?
Hi. Yeah, I'm good. Just to piggyback on that, yeah, I feel like I've met so many shameless self promoters over the years that I've had this like adverse reaction to just trying to backpedal, and I go too far in the other direction. So yeah.
Well, no, but it's people. Okay, it depends. If you're doing something that's obviously brilliant, and somebody's telling you it's brilliant, and you're saying, "Oh no, it's terrible," well, then that's false modesty. But if you're, oh, really? Oh, thank you. That's really kind of you. Thank you, because I really worked hard on this. I appreciate that. You don't have to say that. Whatever the downplay is, while still accepting the compliment.
Right.
I think that's the difference. Now, I got married to a wonderful Israeli lady about 13 years ago. I was still married. And when we went out on our first date, I said to her, "Oh, you look really nice." And she said, "I know." And it shocked me, absolutely shocked me, being an English person, that somebody would acknowledge that they look good and even seem surprised that it was mentioned because it was obvious. I thought to myself, what's going on here? You're supposed to say, "No, really, this old thing," and all the rest of that stuff.
What do you really think?
Yeah, and they just say what they think, and it's taken me years to get used to it. And even when I first visited their country, somebody would say, "Hey, do you want a drink or whatever? Do you want something?" And in a normal English way, I'd say, "Yeah, oh, sure, if that's okay," as we always say. And I caught her brother one time saying to her, in Hebrew, "Does he want it or not? I don't understand."
Well, yeah, that's never occurred to me that might be a problem culturally, but yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah,
Americans should have something similar. We're reading between the lines in this English Anglo format all the time. The subtext, we're used to it, and some other countries there's no subtext. You just get given it on the plate as it is. Whatever it says on the tin.
I was looking at some other episodes that you've done, and I was really impressed to see the international focus. I mean, just the fact that you're talking to a lot of people that in all different countries that maybe others don't, and so I really admired that wide-ranging cultural exchange. I think that's something that's very important in the paranormal.
And we're all in the world, and sometimes I've done a few recently where there's a language barrier, and so we're trying to keep it very simple. Pre-prepared questions and the rest, and my mumbly kind of voice doesn't help because it's tripping over itself and backtracking and so I'm just trying to keep it really simple for them. But yeah, it's just nice to have people like yourselves on that are saying something different about this genre. Now, I have at least one of your books, Joshua, on my wish list. I haven't bought it yet, but it's been on there for a little while now. When I looked at it today, Where the Footprints End, the volume one, and when I looked at it today, there was so much on there, even in the write-up, that struck a chord with me because, cryptozoology, there's a lot of sameness everywhere, and there's a lot of platitude, I guess, foundational truths that are based upon theories, but we've made the foundations of everything. And I looked and I saw some of the things you were saying. I was like, wow, you're saying there's something more complex than an undiscovered gorilla, and they consistently appear alongside, high strangeness and orbs and other different weird paranormal phenomena. I just thought, wow, that's really refreshing, because it's sort of woo, but not really. You're saying, yes, there's something physical about it. So I thought I'd just pick your brain about that today.
Yeah, it's been a bit frustrating for me because I feel like there's so much rich folklore to be mined from cryptozoology, and I just feel like cryptozoology as a whole is not there yet. You look at sort of the discussions that are being had. I don't know, maybe Alison can say if this is happening in the ghost world. She's probably a little bit more plugged into that than I am. But like, especially in the UFO topic, people are talking about symbolism and, ancient ideas and things like soulcraft and all these sort of folkloric correspondences. And the general public face of cryptozoology is just things like big monkey, big monkey, big monkey, because I think there's this sort of impulse that a lot of cryptozoologists have. They want to have that "I told you so" moment with the biologists at some point. And I'm not saying that there's, like, at the end of the day, I want it to be a big monkey as well, but there's such a richness there that can be mined, and I just still don't see a lot of people doing it. Now, having said that, it's really fascinating to me that every time I get a Bigfooter in private, even the ones who ascribe publicly to this idea of it being a relic hominid, they'll say, well, I still think it's a flesh and blood creature, but, and then they'll say all this, they'll acknowledge that there's weirdness with that involved. I just had that same experience at doing some field work this past weekend. There are some folks who are adamant that, someday we might be able to shoot it. But yeah, it also seems to show up in conjunction with strange lights and, all this other stuff. And I'm not saying it's disingenuous. I'm just saying that the community hasn't quite reached that moment yet. Alison, I feel like maybe the UFO people are probably the ones having these conversations the most, but do you see a little bit of that sort of openness in the
ghost
sort
world?
of ghost community? Yeah, in the ghost world. Everybody's still married to the dead person hypothesis, aren't they?
I have been really disappointed with the level of discourse, and feel that it's oversimplified. And part of the problem is that I think people in the paranormal field are very influenced by television, very television driven. And I understand that because, it's really hard to make money as a parapsychologist. And I, have my own ghost tour company. So, I am also milking that entertainment connection. But to me, that doesn't mean that you don't make connections cross culturally, and you don't make connections to folklore. I really see another problem too is that the knowledge base is not there in terms of history, even the history of this field. I think a lot of people who are into ghost hunting really were inspired by the TV shows, and they don't know anything of the researchers that came before. And that's really sad. And so I don't think
you say who's Hans Holzer to them, and they're like, who?
Right. Well, now there's a TV show, The Holzer Files. So finally we delved into that.
Was that with Dave?
It's like.
But now you're dealing with people who are like, oh, this Hans Holzer guy, I didn't know about it. It's like, well, if you've been paying attention,
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
even further back than that with like Catherine Crowe, for example,
Mm-hmm.
nobody realizes that all these, a lot of these phenomena go back further, like even NDEs, OBEs, stuff like that, twin telepathy. These were things that in the night side of nature, they're right in there. And yes, the modern term hadn't been coined, but these things were on people's minds in the 19th century and even before that. So I just think that the field could use an infusion of this cross-cultural, folkloric, historical knowledge, and so that we can start having some more complex conversations.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I know that something that you're aware of, Alison, is oh, this house has a lady in white, and it's like, okay, well, what is the fact that 1,000 other haunted locations have ladies in white? Does that tell us anything about the phenomenon itself, or are you just treating these all as separate instances of a lady in white? Yeah,
right.
And sort of questions that need to be asked. Yeah,
and so for me, I'm thrust like right in the middle of that, because I develop haunted history tours, and then I find these similar tropes occurring across different destinations, and we focus on America because it's American Ghost Walks, but I notice that, like, in New England, for example, there are a lot of hauntings that I'm like, oh, isn't there like a equivalent to this across the pond that I've heard about? Sometimes I hear a story and it rings a bell about,
I was going to ask you
something
about that. Yeah.
in the UK, and I'm like, wow, it just like transferred over.
My latest. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No.
Take over.
Well, I was just going to say that it's something that you probably noticed as well, Joshua, in cryptozoology, is that especially when you go into an international view of the phenomena, is that there are creatures, especially with colonization, that exist in the parent country and the colonized countries. And recently, I was looking at the Cuero in Patagonia, which is this kind of weird ray or big cowhide kind of like creature that envelops animals or people that come to the shore and takes them under the water. And it exists in the history of the Mapuche people, but not the Trail Kefe, I'm probably saying that wrong, who are just next door. And it also exists in one of the parent countries as well, in Spain. So there's this similar sort of cowhide kind of myth that translates over, and it's the same with werewolves in North America, New England, of course. I mean, it's in the name, right? For the thing that you're talking about, that you would have this colonial transplant in a way, at least in the translation of what people are seeing. Oh, what do you think about that?
One of my favorite. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go first. You go first. I definitely want to jump in too.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite examples of that is the, speaking of New England, the puckwudgie stuff. I mean, that term is, I believe it's a Midwestern term, but you don't hear about puckwudgies in the Midwest because there were some, colonial American authors who loved that term so much, and they sort of applied it over there. And now you get these stories about puckwudgies being these, indigenous spirits of New England, and you're like, well, not really. And of course, there were little people legends, but they didn't call them puckwudgies or puckmowudgies or any of these sort of things. But over time, you sort of get these beliefs that accrete around displaced folklore, and it suggests to me, and a lot of folks who are involved in these topics don't really like to hear this, but it suggests to me that we are playing a much greater role in how these things manifest, because I think that there is an objective nature to it. Like, I think that people often see things just as they're describing them. But I do think that somehow we are having this interplay with these phenomena, and we are contributing our own cultural baggage and the baggage of the history. And sometimes that it does include basically imported myths and legends. I mean, there are plenty of examples specifically regarding the fairy folk here in America that, that got imported or syncretized. I mean, that's another thing that's kind of hard to tell. But yeah, it's something that I think that is very much underserved in the discussion of these topics.
Absolutely. Do you think then, I had another thought about it recently, Joshua, which was originally when we came to these countries and took over, do you think that the natives of these places could have learned essentially to describe what their local phenomena were in terms that we were familiar with? So, this is why perhaps there is a duende, in Central and South America, just like there was in Spain and Portugal. There's certainly dwarf and gnome-like stories all over the world, but that would have been the terminology that the Spanish colonists were familiar with. So could it be that there is something, and yet they've chosen our terms with which to explain it?
I got to jump in here.
I want Alison to jump in first. Yeah.
I just think that's wonderful what you just said, this bridge, because I've often wondered about how much native cultures have been influenced by colonizing cultures. But that's another way to think of it. Maybe it was just a way that these different people were able to communicate, and they were just, both ways, looking for terms that would match up. And maybe these phenomena have always been there in these various manifestations. And it was just terminology that was standing in the way. But I just wanted to say earlier about the duendes that it's just so unusual to see that also in the Philippines and in Guam as well. Exactly. And you would think Guam is so remote, and they have duendes as well. And it's just you can see some of that Spanish influence. They do have like a lady in white on a bridge too in Guam. I'm always kind of looking for cultures that maybe weren't as influenced by missionaries or colonizers, and that would even be like a bigger possible proof to me that there have been there's a similar phenomenon among these cross cultures, but it sure is weird. It's like I'm like, how completely could missionaries, they're supposed to tell you about Jesus, right? Right. They're not supposed to tell you about all this folkloric stuff. It's amazing to me. For example, I used to teach at a Native American school for 13 years. And, I would notice, these similarities. For example, we used to do this grandmother moon ceremony where we'd save all our hair, and then we'd put it in little yellow ties, and then we'd burn it at the full moon. But there were also these other ideas, when one of the reasons for doing that was that you didn't want witches to get that hair and perform that sympathetic magic. So you wanted to, keep your combings and then burn them every month. And okay. I was like, wow, did that come from the missionaries, or was that a real indigenous belief? And then we have other issues when people who aren't native, and they come along and they say, oh, this is a native legend, and they take their own artistic license with that. So for example, the Piasa bird in Alton, Illinois, is this legend of this fierce flying creature that was eating the native population, the Illini population, and there's this big drama about how the chief sacrificed himself. So he was bait so that the warriors could come out and ambush this thing and all that. And okay, I know there are cultures, native cultures, that are very concerned about the predatory nature of the thunderbird, but not in Illinois, not in Wisconsin, where I'm from. The thunderbird is revered, and there's a water creature named Mississippi that is of utmost concern, drowning swimmers and canoeists. And in Alton, there were pictographs on a rock face near rapids that canoeists would see as they're traveling, and that got transmogrified over history into a bird creature, and it is a deadly.
Isn't that strange? Because on the cliff, the bird creature has horns, like the pictograph has horns. On the cliff, so maybe that's the connection. It's the same everywhere. One thing that really stands out to me, Alison, and I think maybe this is a bigger link in many ways to this joined up folklore we have all over the world, is that we're all human beings. So there's a limited scope to the way in which we all express ourselves within culture and religion and mythology, and we have similarities. Even without connection, we have similarities in the way we do things.
That's where I've landed on a lot of, especially, the old ancient monument stuff, because it's been so tantalizing to pursue this line of speculation that there was some sort of master race that went around to these different places building pyramids. And obviously that leads to some really, nasty places. But my contention is that no, you see pyramids everywhere because, much like the bow and arrow, it's a technology that works. No one really says, I'm sure that there are some instances where bows and arrows were introduced to some populations, but there is also the idea that these things sort of, much like convergent evolution or something, there's sort of just these technologies arose because they work and they were made by human hands.
They make sense.
Yeah. So a lot of, in the instances of some of these earthworks that you see in the New World versus the Old World, especially regarding the fairy forts in Ireland and the British Isles, I just think that they look so similar because you can put some pictures of pre-excavated American mounds next to some Irish fairy forts. They look practically identical. And I suspect that the reason that these things look so similar is because they not only serve similar functions, often being sepulchral sites, but also because this is just the way that we as a species express ourselves, and perhaps we all sort of independently came to the conclusion that these are good ways to interface with the more than human world.
Absolutely. I mean, like the ancients all building in stone in an unconnected fashion all around the world. Well, stone is permanent and it's everywhere. So it's a great building material. Yeah. So you learn to use it because whatever you build with it will still be there in 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. And I think that's definitely a really good explanation for that. I'm interested, you guys, about the Sasquatch stuff as well, about this, because I'm like, there's a big gorilla, there's an ape out there kind of guy my whole life, and my whole cryptozoological life. And I do regularly encounter people who say, but I also saw an orb, or I also saw a light, or there was a strange phenomenon of fear or something like that around at the time. I felt compelled to run off the mountain straight away, and that's when I saw it. So they get the feeling first, and then afterwards there was some lights and one or two of these other things. What are your thoughts about this? What is this, the frequency of this connection, the percentage in your opinion, and what do you think it means?
Well, sort of having, sorry, I don't mean to step on top of you, Alison, but this is sort of in my wheelhouse. So having embarked on this project with my co-author Tim Renner on Where the Footprints In, those two books, I would think that Tim is probably of the opinion that high strangeness is not only more common than expected, but it might even be a hallmark of the phenomenon. Mm-hmm. My general rule of thumb is that the people who tend to have fleeting sightings, of like a hunter sees something walk through a scope or something, tend to gravitate more towards the explanation that it's a large hairy animal. And the people who have more longitudinal contact, some of these people who claim to be habituators or people who return to the same research sites over and over again, they're the ones who start to notice more of the high strangeness. And it's a lot of the similar oddities that you've noticed from the UFO phenomenon that crop up. People have strange synchronicities. There are anomalous light phenomena, sometimes out of place animals, just strange sounds that shouldn't be in the forest, like car doors slamming and stuff like that. Just sort of real 1970s John Keel style stuff.
No, absolutely. And I never spoke to people that say it, very genuinely. And
again, like once you get the Bigfooters to the bar after their conference presentation and you get a couple of beers in them, like you start to hear these stories. A lot of them have these stories. And the main thing that I sort of take umbrage with is I feel like there's a certain level of not cognitive dissonance, but intellectual dishonesty. I'll take your report as long as you say that the Bigfoot crossed the road, but the moment you say that it turned into a ball of light on the other side of the road, well, I'm going to toss that in the rubbish bin. And it's like, well, I think that if eyewitness reports are the bedrock of these studies, which by necessity they are, you kind of have to do something with that. I'm not saying you have to believe every person's story and treat it with equal weight, but you have to do something with it, even if you keep it in a separate file. And even if you want to say, well, we have flesh and blood Bigfoot, but we also have something that looks like a flesh and blood creature that does this other stuff. You've got to do something with it, right? But I think that's in my opinion, that's the sort of the critical mistake that a lot of cryptozoologists make, is that they say, oh, look, everywhere that there's a culture, more or less, you can quibble some with Africa for certain, but everywhere that there's a culture, there's a story of a wild man.
In Africa too, by the way.
That exists.
Absolutely.
There are. I suspect that being a culture that lived alongside primates, being a lot of these different cultures having interactions, they probably didn't. I've heard some stories, but they're not nearly as. Again, that's sort of a reportage problem that we have with just these sort of blank areas on the map. We don't talk about Chinese UFO sightings. We don't talk as much about African UFO sightings. So we have some gaps in our knowledge here. But I would argue that pretty much any culture that many cultures, if not most or even all, have these stories of wild men that always sort of exhibit the same suite of behaviors. And the cryptozoologists will say they're on every continent. And it's like, okay, or it's sort of a co-traveler with humanity, much in the same way that the UFO phenomenon is. I mean, one of my favorite examples that I love to cite is it's kind of become common amongst certain segments of the Bigfoot cryptozoology community to discuss hair braiding, the idea that that Bigfoot will steal into your stable and braid your horse's hair. And there have even been some reports. I found one in Russia of a researcher who said that they actually saw an Almasty, one of the Russian Bigfoots, go into a stable and braid a horse's mane. And
I know this report.
Well, but then you look at sort of the folklore and you see how often, again, your neck of the woods, that this same phenomena would be blamed on fairies, or it would be blamed on witches, or So is it that Bigfoot just so happened to engage in the same behavior that we once used to ascribe to other supernatural creatures, or are they all of a similar origin, a similar quality, a similar character? Now, whatever that means, the skeptics will say it means that we're all making it up. I would sort of lean towards the idea that these sort of all stem from the same source.
What do you think about, and maybe Alison, you can chime in on this as well, what do you think about if they are emanations of a type? What do you think about them being genre or let's say era specific, so that I don't know if you're familiar with that scene on Men in Black 3 where he goes back to the 60s and all of the aliens are depicted in the way we've thought of them in the 60s, right? And I thought about that a lot, and that's come up a lot in cryptozoology, and I've noticed people's difference in age and belief in genre by the way they describe something. What do you think about these emanations being specific to the genre that's prevalent at times? So if it's a revealing in some way, in the old days it would be fairies. Now it would be Sasquatch. Do you think there's something in that at all?
Well, I think that question goes with the latest book, which I have right here. Very
Yeah,
films.
great. Oh, wow.
But
That's
so
on my
fairy
list too, by the
films,
way.
we folk on the big screen. So yeah, like in my essay, I talked a lot about how these things are other intelligences and may present in whatever way they feel like it. So they if they feel like presenting themselves, as diminutive little beings that are kind of dressed like you, but with clothes from the past or something like that, then they're going to do that. Or if they want to be a big hairy humanoid, they're going to do that. Or if they're going to want to be Mothman, they're going to do that. And I'm just thinking that that there's no way that we really know what these things are. When you talk about the Fae folk, you're talking about an acknowledged intelligence that has the power to change the way you think and see through glamour and to deceive. So yeah, I mean, if these things are really out there, which they very well could be, we are kind of playing blind, trying to figure out what exactly they are. And we can't see them on a regular basis, and maybe that's by design on their part. Maybe it's because we're living at different wavelengths, but then these creatures may have the ability to completely change how we see them. So we're always kept on edge. So that's the way I look at it. In my essay, I talk about the word troll in particular, and how we all, like I just said, troll, and how that Icelandic creature, that has a certain appearance to us. Like saying that right now, I just popped into your head what you think a troll might look like, but the actual word itself was not so much used in that way, where it was focused on something specific. It really meant the other, and like a troll could be a witch, for example. So a troll could be many things, and it's just kind of a catch-all term for the other. But yet today, when we think of troll, we have a very defined idea of what that is. And
that's probably very true.
That's probably just a smokescreen.
See, this is why I hang out with you, Alison, because you're just taking words out of my mouth. Yeah, I resonate strongly with all of that, and I would sort of add, just sort of loop it back around to what we first started talking about. It would seem as if perhaps culture sort of brings a component to the way that these things like to appear. Like that's where I kind of land. I don't have anything to objectively prove that, but that's my suspicion. Is that a lot of the manifestations or forms that these things take are somehow, I think it's a two-way communication between us and whatever this other intelligence this is, which may be a part of us for all we know. But like I think that there's some sort of exchange there, which is the only way that I can really reconcile things like the importations of beliefs from colonizer countries into indigenous populations and things like that. Yeah.
That makes sense. It makes sense. I mean, I guess what it seems that you're saying, it would make sense to me that the transmogrification of the physical appearance of these creatures over the decades and hundreds of years, even eras, genres, seems to be something that people are overlooking. So you really made a point of talking about that in your book as well, that there is this link to the past that we're now forgetting. What was once, boggarts and fairies and the rest of that stuff is now Sasquatch and Dogman and the rest of this. And I was saying to somebody recently, I interviewed, I said, in one of the books I wrote for the Dogman section, I put Dogman rebranding the werewolf, because it clearly seemed to be a rebranding
Yep.
of the werewolf, but we didn't want to be embarrassed by that word anymore. So we called it something that we could claim was a physical being. And yet Bigfoot seems plausible as a physical entity, a living creature that could be undiscovered. But Dogman is completely,
Yeah.
How do we explain that?
Like,
and yet you've got witnesses as valid, one as valid as the other. Sometimes I know a great Bigfoot researcher who never saw a Bigfoot, but saw a Dogman. She never expected that.
I recently heard a story from someone who talked about a law enforcement officer being chased away from a crime scene by a Bigfoot and a Dogman working in tandem.
Wow. Okay.
Which, I'm tempted to be very
skeptical,
hypocritical, actually, considering what I just said about Bigfoot turning into balls of light. But at the same time, I think that, to me, it's not a smoking gun, but it's the smell of gunpowder, right? In terms of these things being the same thing, because part of me refuses to believe that a physical half man, half dog and a physical giant relic hominid are working in tandem, like have some sort of partnership. It gets into what I call like Star Wars thinking, where you've got whenever I hear these UFO stories and they get really specific with like intergalactic politics and organizations.
Oh, okay.
Carthlaxians are attacking
the Palladians versus
it's just like, okay, well, this starts to sound like a fantasy, and I have a more sympathetic idea that fantasy can bleed over into reality than most people, but I don't think it's an objective reading of what's going on.
And it has to be a facet of taking the report. Is this person who's giving me this report, are they struggling in some way with reality because they're saying very unrealistic, very fantastical things? And many times in my chats with people, I've been very direct in a very kind and normal way to say, I have to ask you, do you have any issues of this nature? It doesn't exclude your sighting in any way, but it is a factor we have to take into consideration. So if you tell me, it's private, I'll take it into consideration. And if you do have problems with hallucinations and fantasy, if you have that kind of thing, have you ever experienced it like this before? Is this outside the norm?
Right.
Can we still include it? And occasionally people have said, yeah, I've got some issues. Oh no, it's never happened. And this thing took place in isolation.
Well, and then we get into this sort of thorny issue of whether or not we truly understand a lot of mental illness in the first place.
Yeah,
and there are therapists who are seeing great progress with some of their schizophrenic patients by having them engage with the voices as opposed to ignoring them or dulling them with medication, which suggests that there might be something actually on the other end of the line, that they're interacting with.
Perhaps indeed. No, it's amazing. Let's go back to the fairy films book, because I love the cover. I saw the cover when I was thinking, I'm going to ask Joshua to come on the show, and let's just have a quick look through what he's doing at the moment. And then that came up, fairy films, and I just thought, wow, great cover, great. I even love the little sort of camera roll in the middle, everything. Of course, it's a collection of essays on this subject that you've edited together and written around with the folk like Alison. Just take us through that a bit, both of you, and what does it comprise of, and what's the philosophy of the book?
Well, as I sort of alluded to, I'm becoming more interested in how we have this sort of interplay and exchange between expectations and fictions and the reality of these phenomena. And I always thought it would be interesting to sort of take a look at how influential fairy folklore remains. Like, for the longest time, I had this idea that maybe I'm going to put together a coffee table book full of words that people don't normally associate with fairies that we still cling to, like the medical term stroke, which is, obviously a derivation of the fairy stroke, or the term for the color cobalt, that's, based off the kobolds of German and Austrian folklore. But that sort of idea, that's a market of like 5 people, of which probably me and Alison are 2, right? So, so like it's a great idea now for me. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. But so the idea for something like fairy films came along. It was right in the beginning of the pandemic. I had another project, actually, I think it was Footprints Volume 2, that was sort of still being worked on, but a lot of my work on it had sort of finished. And I was looking to occupy myself, and I rounded up a rogues gallery of people that I admired who were friends. Some of whom, were, and it ended up being this broad spectrum of paranormal researchers and academics and fantasy authors, and it kind of gives the whole the final product probably a little bit of a shaggy vibe, but I kind of think it's an endearing vibe, because it does cover the spectrum of all these different things. And sort of the original idea was to, much as in that fairy word coffee table book that may or may not exist in the future, the original idea was to sort of illustrate how, even though we think of sort of the fairy folklore as a fantasy or being like its own discrete thing, it just bleeds over into all these other genres in ways that we don't fully apprehend. And so that was the original idea for the project. Some folks, I say this with all the love in my heart, they didn't get the memo. So they ended up like talking about stuff that literally involved fairies. I think Allison's kind of like is in the middle there. But some folks, talked about films that like literally talked about fairies. And at first I was like, God, this isn't really what I want. But then I discovered that it's interesting to see how the authenticity of fairy folklore still shines through, even in the face of, what I would call fairy disinformation, the sort of pop culture version of fairies. I think Simon Young's essay on Walt Disney's approach to fairy films sort of is a good example of that. But I basically said, pick a film, make a case for it, and I'll probably say yes. And I don't think I turned down anybody's pitch, honestly.
Okay.
But yeah, it was a couple of us, and we all worked on the pandemic. And that actually sat, gosh, Allison, when did I have all these essays collected? It was probably back in 2020, right? Probably October of 2020.
Yeah, it was quite a while.
We had some publishing issues, and there's been some just generalized adversity surrounding the project that I probably prefer not to get into. But
sure, there's always some. I mean, it would be unusual for things to be smooth. So
yeah, and there's some sort of tragedy involved in that too.
I'm sorry.
But we ended up with so go ahead. Yeah, I mean,
this is involving the
it's got the F word. Yeah, it's got the F word in the title.
We said the other F word, and so that might be an issue.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to say it, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Although I know some people who are very much fairy believers who still use the term without any issue. So I think the fact that I just, it's smeared across the front cover is the main issue.
It's there, but I mean, you spelt it with the So I mean, you didn't FAE spell it, so that's all.
Yeah. But anyway, so we finally got back into production in December of 2022, and honestly, I don't know. I'm sure Allison feels the same way. The fact that it's actually in physical space is something of a miracle, because for the longest time I had resigned myself to the fact that it just wasn't going to get published. So I compiled a bunch of people that I really admired, and Allison I think you were always on my list. I think you were one of the first people I reached out to.
Thanks.
And what I love about your essay specifically is the way that you so many of the essays are dedicated to one film, which was again sort of the idea, but you and Simon Young and I think a couple of other people sort of took a look at several different things.
I just kind of went nuts.
A lot of bang for your buck, though, right?
Because the thing that I always have loved about Joshua's work is what is revealed by the lens that he looks at things through. And so to me, some of these tropes that are still going maybe show us that there is some reality to these fae related phenomena. And so that's what I think, like, I'm Joshua, I'm rereading Thieves in the Night right now. Yeah.
The creepy one,
yeah. And so it's just so interesting how now you have, the UFO people and how they're describing things, and they want to be, or they think they are, like totally separate from these other earlier similar manifestations. And you show there's continuity. There's some things that are still like these tropes that are still coming through, which to me speaks to the reality of something strange going on. And that we're just seeing it in different ways over time. That's why I was just so excited to write about it. And so I just couldn't stop, like with the, I talk about mostly big screen, but sometimes small screen, and how all these tropes are still coming through. And then also I talked about scary fairies. So the good neighbors, they can be wonderful. They can also be horrible, just like humanity. I'm speaking of them and to them with the utmost respect, that I know that they are capable of anything. And so a lot of times when we think of fairies, like we don't think of the boogeyman, for example. And but that boogeyman comes from Bogart. Bugbear, Bogart. Yeah, that's right. So so we don't usually make that connection that's fairy, or we don't see that. A lot of people kind of treat fairies like they're just ridiculous right now, but they don't see how they were so often conflated with demons, with the dead, and they can be very, very powerful in some truly horrible ways. And so I looked at film, but then I also looked at perhaps instances that are really unexplained illnesses and death. And kind of put that all together, because I always want to write about some mystery that is still really unsolved, and it seemed to me that those things connected in interesting ways, and so that's what my essay is about. Wow. It's about scary fairies, boogeymen of yore. And I'm really excited to go see Stephen King's The Boogeyman, which just came out in the US. Okay. Yeah. And because The Boogeyman, and Stephen King, I do talk a little bit about him, but not enough. I should have talked about his series The Outsider, because that seems to be about a solitary fairy who is capable of these terrible, heinous acts against children, and these extraordinary feats of glamour that allow it, or whatever it is, to do that. But again, I didn't talk about that one at all in the essay. But it's always compelling to me to see how reality and fantasy come together sometimes, art informing life and back and forth, and I think there might be some real unsolved mysteries, and so that's what I focused on in my essay.
It sounds fascinating. It really does, Alison. Do you think, in relation to that, reality informing fantasy, or film and fiction and books and the like, do you think that there is something of a residual inherited folkloric memory that we all have in our societies to a various degree that informs that? For example, I'm not a Catholic or anything like that, but I come from an Irish family originally, that was our background. And whenever a hearse passes me by in the street, without even thinking of it, I've crossed myself in respect, or have taken my hat off or something like that. And I don't cross myself in any other part of life at any point, but that seems to me to be a superstition, but a cultural superstition. That's a muscle memory. It's part of my muscle memory, reactive memory.
It became ingrained somehow.
I have to do it, but I've never seen my father do that or anybody else. But I know that it's a sign of respect. So it's weird. And I've just found myself maybe a little while back, I don't know what it was. The hearses came by with the coffin, and immediately I took off my hat, across myself and stood until they passed me. Yeah, on the road. I was on the sidewalk. And I thought, isn't that odd? Right after I did it, I thought, no, isn't that odd? Where did that come from?
Yeah, like how much of it is that, and how much of it is a real phenomenon that we're just trying to deal with, and our culture needs to explain it in some way. You know, I like with what may be sleep paralysis, or could be some creatures actually attacking, you know, nocturnal attacks. You know, those things do happen to people, but what is it? Is it just this medical thing? Or are we putting this medical thing on top of something real, you know, like a real interaction? And we just look at the, you know, the physical mechanisms and try to explain it away based on that. But
could it be both, you know, depending on the situation? Same as when you have a dream that's prophetic or a message in some way, and other times it's just all of your thoughts spewing out, you know, into the dream space. Could it be both?
It's interesting to me because I've spent some time thinking of this lately, and you know, I think that we gloss over things like instinct far too much. You know, you can have a baby chicken, a chick that's raised indoors all its life, and if you pass a shadow of a hawk over it in its indoor enclosure, it's still going to duck and run for cover. And we just say things like, "Oh, it's an instinct," you know. The chicken's, you know, ancestors learned the hard way that the ones who survived, you know, all that yada yada yada. But it just seems, some of these things seem so specific, and I kind of wonder if crossing yourself isn't that way. And similarly, you know, not quite the same thing, but when I had a day job, I was often told that people could tell I was in the building because I was always whistling. I don't whistle that much anymore. That's neither here nor there. But I later learned that my father said that people could tell when he was in the courthouse when he was whistling, and that my grandfather was in the hospister when he was whistling. So it's kind of one of those things like just, I guess there's a whistling gene, but but this also speaks to, like, I think we sort of underappreciate the objectivity of the sort of well of either a well of tradition or a well of folklore or a well of knowledge, or, you know, heaven forbid, the objective nature of these things. I think we kind of underestimate that. There's the book actually opens up with a wonderful essay by Jack Hunter, Dr. Jack Hunter, that includes excerpts from a previously unpublished Brian Froud essay. And sort of obliquely, it gets mentioned how, you know, Brian Froud has weathered some criticism about how similar some of his fairy depictions look to John Bauer's artwork, if you're familiar with that artwork as well. And I love Froud's response, which was basically, if memory serves, something to the effect of, you know, well, John's fairies look like my fairies because that's just what they look like. And I love that sort of matter of fact, like, you know, these things probably speak to people in similar ways.
Yeah. So. Well, and of course, and if they are real, then yeah, they would have a form that it's fixed within, you know, a variety of manifestations. So that makes perfect sense. What do you both think about philosophical interpretation, religious? We talked about that recently, religious and philosophical interpretation. And I mentioned this a lot. I have one religion. My wife has another religion. So we have two similar but different religions. And often in the past, I've noticed that we'll have a little bit of a different interpretation of the same events within that prism of religious belief. And now in our post-religious society, you know, there's all of these philosophical or pseudo-spiritual outlooks and interests that we have in life, you know, be it Sasquatch, be it ghosts, be it fairies, UFOs, whatever it might be, take up a lot of spiritual space in our bodies, you know, in our minds. I wonder, do you think a lot of what we're seeing out there, or at least what we're focusing our interest upon, our interpretations, are these to do with our philosophical outlooks? You know, so the woo plus the flesh and blood camp, everybody else, and we're all stuck into this because this is why people get so angry as well, because this is my belief. And you've insulted my belief now by saying it's not a flesh and blood animal. It's a boggart or whatever,
Yeah.
what do you think about that theory that we're all just pummeling these phenomena with our philosophies, to strain out, I suppose a predetermined, I'll get to the point eventually, a predetermined picture of what we'd like to see.
Well, I'm just going to jump in and then I'll let Allison take the floor. But I've often said that I think that the modern UFO experience and the historical fairy experience are describing the same thing, but I don't think that either interpretation is correct. Because it would be really easy to say, oh, well, the aliens are just fairies, the fairies are just aliens. But I think both of those are they're so culturally bound, and I think they are sort of playing upon our sort of not only expectations, but what we're most comfortable with at the time. So, of course, in this older fairy stuff, you get all this stuff about, in parts of northern Scotland, the fairy timed to hell, where they're going around collecting souls and the conflation with demons and whatnot. And of course, in this modern, dare I say, more atheistic era, of course, it's all sort of reducible to this materialist interpretation. Oh, well, we're people that like to go out and tag grizzly bears. So, of course, people from other planets would do the same thing with human beings. It does sort of express that sort of stripped away version of these things. I heard, I believe it was Martin Cottenmeyer, who's just one of the great unsung heroes of analytical sort of psychosocial ufology. I believe it was him who speculated recently that, well, if the dead sort of evolved into fairies and the fairies sort of evolved into UFO occupants, what's the next iteration of that? And I believe he was the one who suggested that it might be AI in general, that AI might sort of end up filling that gap, which, as loath as I am to give AI any more attention today than it has, I can sort of see it filling that gap. People sort of displacing all these similar suite of phenomena and observations onto AI. Okay, I'm out.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
okay,
thank you.
I'm really glad, Joshua, that you mentioned AI, because I've been thinking of that, because we're talking about other intelligences other than human intelligences, and this is the time to talk about it, because I have been very aware and keeping myself up to date on all this AI news, and it's just really fascinating to me. And we are a lot of people think we're facing an existential threat, and that's not me just trying to fearmonger. Really, I'm not. I'm just astonished that so many intelligent people are considering this. Not just that it could do harm to us, but it could actually lead to our extinction. That's what people are saying.
Yeah, it has that very first 15 minutes of a 1950s B sci-fi film sort of vibe right now,
setup.
doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the setup.
It's
Absolutely.
very frightening.
It's the setup.
I'm really I'm excited about it, but it is very frightening that it's having that lead up, like as if we were in a film. And we're ignoring the warnings, and we're just
and we've
just
been in that kind
ahead.
of space, that weird, unreal film-like space for the last 3 years anyway, haven't we? So this arriving at this point, it's like, okay, so what's next?
Yeah, so it's interesting that we're talking about this now, and the book came out at the time that it did, because I think, again, I got to go back to the fact that this is just an other than human intelligence, and we have to grapple with our limitations in dealing with it. Religion, definitely does shape, how we see these things. Because I was just talking to a person who runs ghost tours and also does investigations, and we were just comparing notes, and she just said, Alison, I had this experience in one of the locations with, something that seemed like a trickster. And she felt she was going towards the idea that it was demonic. But then I shared with her that when I was teaching at this native school, just 1 year, for whatever reason, it's not like it was like this every year. I taught there for 13 years. Only 1 year did something like this happen, where strange things were going on around the school, and this led, some of the elders that were teachers at the school to sound the alarm that there was a trickster that was active in the building. Now, this is super subjective, but it would be disingenuous for me to say that that everything that happened was completely normal. I mean, although these experiences are very subjective,
something was definitely happening.
Something happened. I broke my ankle under very strange circumstances, which, seemed to be attributed. But certainly when I came to school with that, my mentor, my Oneida teacher, was like, "Oh no, I got you too." But I had a very different relationship with it. Yes, it did break my ankle, but I felt like this is just going to sound crazy, but I felt like in my interactions with it that it was kind of joking with me and not a threat to me other than the ankle. But for other people, it was not so kind. And there were deaths associated that seemed to be associated with it that year.
Gosh.
And and the school went to great lengths to get the trickster off the grounds.
Absolutely.
And but even knowing the death toll, the things that this thing is capable of, I can't just pigeonhole. I can't just frame it as, oh, it's a demon. To me, it's just another intelligence, and who's to say what it was doing was ultimately for good or evil? Maybe it's to teach us something. I don't really know, but it was just
sorry.
I just had this conversation this week, and her perspective about what seemed like a similar entity was very different than my perspective. She took like the more Judeo-Christian view of it being demonic, and I was like, it's just another intelligence, and it could do terrible things, but I don't know that means it's a demon.
I suppose that's the very interesting thing, like you said, about perspective. And she took the Judeo-Christian view that it was demonic, and you said, but it's just an intelligence. And that's exactly what she's saying to you. It's demonic intelligence. And it's funny, but you say, well, no, maybe it's just, because obviously the perspective is that's a great evil, right? But you see, but maybe it's just an entity. Were people killed in accidents, or did just things happen like heart attacks and cancers and weird things like that?
Suicides.
Oh gosh, that's terrible.
And other things as well.
That's very sad. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Andy always has to pry. He sooner or later he will step over that line. I apologize.
And maybe it's not right to equate those things, but I mean, they were again, things were strange. That did not happen every year. Things like this. So,
well, it's very sad. And in my very sort of ambiguous English way, I do hope that families of those people are moving on from that experience. With the book, there are just to wrap up, guys. There's a plethora of different fairy films and stories that are involved in this, that are focused. Would you say, Alison, that yours are more towards the paranormal, sort of supernatural activity side? Are there any stories in the book that are focused on visual sightings of these creatures?
Well, I know Jack Hunter has had visual sightings, and I've certainly collected visual sightings. I didn't really focus on that in my essay. I focused on other manifestations being death and strange wounds and strange implantations and stuff like that. But Joshua, are there any other ones in there that deal with visuals?
Yeah, I think it would be safe to say that the lion's share, maybe even an extreme majority of the contributors are people who have either had things happen to them or believe that there is an objective reality to these topics. As far as the sort of experiential angle that you're looking at specifically, or you're asking about specifically, I think most of that is sort of confined to Jack's essay and Mark Anthony Wyatt's essay on Twin Peaks, because he talks about some experiences that people have had. Again, that's just sort of a function of how the book ended up, because you have some academics who sort of keep their own experiences separate from their study of these things. I kind of fall into that camp.
No, I'd say, well. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's interesting if you take a look at sort of the lived experience of seeing the Fae folk, it does suggest that there is, again, it's a common theme in our conversation, this interplay of expectations sort of drifting in, because Simon Young, who contributed the next to last essay in the book, he compiled this wonderful resource you may or may not be aware of, called the Fairy Census, which is just a collection of reports from a broad swath of time.
That sounds very interesting.
Even though it's not indicated in any of the historical literature, you get these tiny little winged ladies who are helping plants grow and doing all that sort of very pop culture fairy stuff. But I have been told by some folks that a lot of the modern encounters seem to be drifting away from that and going toward the darker sort of not winged, can be any size sort of fairy folk, which to me does again suggest, I mean, that would sort of fit with the tenor of the times, with sort of a rise in paganism and astrology and people being sort of interested in these alternative ways of interpreting our reality. I think that sort of is keeping in line with that. So as far as experiential stuff, it's probably confined to that, although a lot of these folks are experiencers themselves.
And last question, I promise I'll let you go after that. I'll drag you on too long. Do you think then we're seeing, in regards to fairies, a kind of resurgent folklore happening around the world? And this is, fairy farms and tours in Ireland and Iceland and places like this, and this interest in great books like the one you've just written as well. Is it because of this longing for magic and fantasy to be a part of our everyday lives again?
I definitely get that sense. I mean, I don't know about you, Alison, but I feel like I see much more Fae and Fae adjacent stuff than I used to in all sectors of different things. I'm not sure if it's a resurgence or if it was more like just something that was lying dormant, because sort of the central idea was that a lot of these books are from the 80s and the 70s, and not books, but a lot of these films are from the 80s and the 70s. So like it's kind of been with us, but we just sort of dress it up in different things. But I think there has been a sort of shift back to sort of embracing these older ways. And I could probably digress into a lot of pseudo academic explanations for why that is. I have a personal suspicion that people are just so frustrated with the state of things that they're sort of seeking to re-enchant their day-to-day lives, but that may or may not be true. But yeah, I do think there has been a noticeable uptick in the number of folks who hear the word fairy and don't snicker, because for the longest time, I know growing up, like that was, if you wanted to say something was absurd, you'd say, well, believing in Bigfoot isn't crazy. At least they don't say that they believe in leprechauns,
exactly.
Or it's always in the same breath, and it's like, well, actually, So, so yeah, that's been my take on sort of the cultural landscape. I don't know how Alison feels about that. But.
Well, I certainly want to re-enchant the world, but I'm not sure if it's more a response to the current way of looking at things isn't sufficient, doesn't answer all the questions. I mean, I spoke at a MUFON conference, and this guy came up to me, and he was kind of afraid to talk about this thing that happened, because UFOs is one thing, but he and his wife had an experience with what sounds very much like a brownie in their home, and so he, for whatever reason, I was talking about airline safety and UFOs, but for whatever reason, I look like a safe person to talk to about that. So
I got that same problem.
Yeah. These. Well, I think it's a definite opportunity. So I think these things are still happening to people, and maybe they find it hard to, like, how do I deal with this?
Yeah.
How do I contextualize it? It doesn't seem to fit anywhere in the fashionable, the fashionable paranormal scene. And I think I've never been to Reykjavik, but I got to talk to the headmaster of the elf school there, and and he said, well, there's such a there's such a large portion of the population in Iceland that is atheist, but they still believe in elves.
Fairies.
And why is that? And he said,
the same in Ireland as well. It's the same now. Yeah.
Yeah. He said that is because, for the simple reason, the real reason, that they just know too many people that these experiences have happened to. They can say, well, I don't think God exists, but I don't know about fairies, because all these people I know have had experiences, and these are smaller countries. So, it's like everybody knows somebody that has had, that they love and respect, that has had these encounters. So I think, maybe we're ready now that we're dealing with AI, to talk about these other intelligences, and to deal with strange things that happen, like strange illnesses, strange death, to look at these things, even though they're hard to look at when you're mourning something that happened. We got to understand these other intelligences better, so we can know what is really happening to us. And not looking at it is just going to mean that we're just going to go on and on blind, when maybe if we looked at it, we could learn something.
Well, it certainly seems as if that is happening, in many ways, at least peripherally. And, I think good luck to you both. I think it's a great sounding book. It's on my list. It's sitting there, has been in the list of a few of them, but now I'm going to click buy on it. And I suggest everybody else does as well, after this interview tonight. Joshua and Alison, thank you so very, very much. I just want all of the audience to know how I threw away all my questions. I had them written out. I didn't use one single question that I had prepared for you. It was just such a natural, wonderful, lovely chat. It's been great to get to meet you both.